Hello and welcome to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith. Today, we're tackling a fascinating and often misunderstood topic. We're going to spend the next few minutes diving deep into Genesis 10:5, 20, and 31, which at first glance seem to contradict Genesis 11:1. Genesis 10 talks about different tribes with their own languages, while Genesis 11 says the whole earth had one language. How do we reconcile this apparent contradiction? Is it a historical accuracy, as some claim, or is there a deeper literary technique at play here? As usual, I'll present a number of different opinions from my research and conclude with my own thoughts. Show notes will include links to all we discuss. Are you ready to dive in? All right, let's learn together. Let's start with Genesis 10:5, 20, and 31 from the New Living Translation. Genesis 10:5. Their descendants became the seafaring peoples that spread out to various lands, each identified by its own language, clan, and national identity. Genesis 10:20. These were the descendants of Ham, identified by clan, language, territory, and national identity. Genesis 10:31. These were the descendants of Shem, identified by clan, language, territory. All right, now the problem as defined by the Big Book of Bible Difficulties is this. Genesis 10:5, 20, and 31 seem to suggest many dialects, which is an apparent conflict with Genesis 11:1 that clearly states the whole earth had one language and one speech. All right, let's begin with the solution from the Big Book of Bible Difficulties, and it's this. These texts speak of two different times. Earlier, while maintaining their trivial distinctions, the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth all spoke the same language. Later, at the Tower of Babel, which we find in Genesis 11, God punished their rebellious attempt by confusing their speech. As a result, tribes could no longer understand one another, though possibly the sub-tribes and clans were allowed a mutual understandable language so that they could still understand one another, close quote. Now, many materialists, and a materialist is defined by dictionary.com as a person who is markedly more concerned with material things than with spiritual, intellectual, or cultural values. And anti-Christian websites have honed in on these discrepancies. Here are a few examples where this contradiction is referenced by several sources. Contradictions in the Bible, and that's from evilbible.com. Bible Contradictions Explained, and that's Skeptics Annotated Bible. And finally, Bible Inconsistencies, a side-by-side comparison of Bible contradictions, and that's from infidels.org. By the way, those website names could use a bit of a marketing revamp, just saying. Each just lists the contradiction with virtually no detail or explanation. I listed the link to the Skeptics Annotated Bible in the show notes as an example. Okay, so as we mentioned, materialist and anti-Christian sites trumpet these verses and their contradictions. Is there an explanation that matches or elaborates further upon the Big Book of Bible Difficulties solution? The MacArthur Study Bible comments on Genesis 10:5 stating, this act describes the situation after the Tower of Babel account in Genesis 11. Okay, it's a brief but similar explanation. But let's dig deeper. Luke Wayne, in his article, Does Genesis Contradict Itself Regarding When Human Language is Divided, adds more depth. Wayne says the following. Something very much like this is also what is happening in Genesis 10 and 11. Genesis 10 stops to show how all the nations and peoples of the world would arise from the descendants of Noah's three sons. The original readers already knew that their world, as they saw it around them, was divided among the diverse people of various nations, tribes, and language groups. Genesis 10 looks forward and shows the lineage that leads to these various people groups, while Genesis 11 jumps back and offers a historical account of why they divided and where the different languages actually come from. Thus, there is no conflict here. Moving ahead, Wayne then offers this conclusion, and I quote, Thus, when we see the word language occur in Genesis 10, we need not single it out and assume the author meant that every generation described was already divided by languages. The author obviously did not mean for us to picture Ham or Shem isolating all their children and teaching each of their sons a different language so that right from the start, their sons were already divided into different languages. The terminology here is simply meant to convey that over the course of generations, these lines were eventually divided into various tribes and cultures living in different places. These divisions certainly included language groups, but the chapter makes no comment as to when or how divided languages came to be. Chapter 11 alone gives a precise account of this, and the data given in chapter 10 does not contradict it. Chapter 10 begins with one family that obviously speaks a common language and goes on to show that generations later, the descendants of that one family have given rise to all the nations of men. Chapter 11 gives us a more historical information on how and why humanity divided as it did. Both chapters are, in fact, in perfect harmony, close quote. Now, Wayne's detailed explanation aligns well with what we see in the text. It highlights the importance of understanding the broader narrative and not getting hung up on isolated verses. Let's continue our research with Gary Vaterlaus and his March 16, 2009 article, Does Genesis Contradict Itself About the Order of Nations? He writes, Genesis 10, often called the Table of Nations, traces the origins of nations and people groups as they dispersed around the world after the flood. It is a historical narrative of the descendants of Noah's 3 sons. So, if Noah and his sons all spoke the same language, where did all these other languages come from? Genesis 11 gives us the answer. These groups of people did not willingly and obediently separate to fill the earth. Rather, we learn in Genesis 11, 1 through 9, why these families separated from each other, and how it came to be that there were so many languages in the world. There is no contradiction here. Moses merely put the effect before the cause. Genesis 10 gives an overview, and then Genesis 11 fills in the details. You often find the same technique in other history books. One chapter might contain an overview of World War I, along with a list of major events. But the very next chapter might detail what the world was like in the years before the war and what events led up to it. Close quote. Okay, now this analogy is spot on. Genesis 10 gives us the broader picture, and Genesis 11 provides the details, showing the cause and effect relationship. To further illustrate this point, let's consider an analogy from the August 13, 2021 article titled, Bible Contradiction. How many languages were there before the Tower of Babel was built? And from here I quote, As a human analogy, I am reading a history book which has a lot of charts and figures concerning the history of the slave trade from Africa to North and South America. There is also a portion of the book that is a more narrative account. The beginning part of the book gives us summarizing data of the hundreds of years of the slave trade across the Atlantic. I don't then say, hey, there's a contradiction, when the narrative portion follows after the statistics for slavery. I don't say, hey, the charts said they were already in North America. Why is it that they are going to North America again as a slave on a ship in the Atlantic? Just because I read in earlier chapters on summarizing facts and figures, don't mean in a later chapter it gives stories of the slave trade that I think there's a contradiction of temporal sequences. One would point out how I have reading comprehension with regards to being aware of literary forms within the book. The same thing is going on with the skeptics here when they pit Genesis 10 against Genesis 11 with genealogical records against historical narratives. Back to me. I think that's a key point. The genealogical records of Genesis 10 compared to the historical narratives of Genesis 11. The Bible Ref website adds some clarity with this explanation. All the ancient world's nations are described in this passage, according to their descent from Noah. Other genealogies in the Bible follow a chain of fathers and sons deep into history. The text is broad, showing the various tribes which came from the major descendants of Noah. The previous verses named the sons and grandsons of Japheth. From Israel's perspective, the tribes and nations that formed from these men were located, for the most part, to the far north. Most of these tribes would have had little impact on Israel's history until their descendants, the Greeks, conquered Israel's territory under Alexander the Great. It's helpful to remember that this spreading out and having separate languages came after the events surrounding the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Until that time, all the people of the earth were concentrated in one region and spoke one language. So let's conclude. While Genesis 10:5 and Genesis 11:1 might seem contradictory at first glance, many scholars argue that they serve different purposes within the text and can be understood as complementary rather than contradictory. Sometimes it's necessary to put historical records out of sequence to genealogical records for it to make sense. Let's take a quick example to make some sense of this. We may say that President Jimmy Carter was born in the state of Georgia. He was not president at the time of his birth, but the information, him being president, is mentioned in the statement to provide more complete information for the reader or listener. This is helpful in understanding Genesis 10:5 in relation to Genesis 11:1. Get ready for our next episode, where today we've kind of teased the Tower of Babel. We'll explore Genesis 11:5 and the Tower of Babel, which leads us to ask this question: how can God come down from heaven when he is already here and everywhere? What's going on here? Join us as we dive deep into this fascinating mystery. You may reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Tell a friend or two as well, and also write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, or any of your venues of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long, everybody.